the journey of 1,000,000 souls through the desert. Have you ever wondered what it would look like if 1,000,000 people, men, women, and children, walked together through a burning desert, guided not by maps or compasses, but by faith alone? A sea of humanity stretching beyond the horizon, babies crying, old men stumbling under the cruel sun, mothers clutching their newborns, and fathers silently praying for strength to take one more step. This was no migration, no mere journey of survival. This was the Exodus, the birth of a nation under God's hand. But here's the question that no one ever really asks. How did they survive? How did over 1,000,000 people find water in a wasteland where not even a cactus could grow? How did they feed their families every day for 40 years, when there were no farms, no markets, no rivers? And perhaps the hardest question of all, why did God command them to wander until an entire generation had died? Was it punishment, or was it preparation? Because what happened in those 40 years in the desert was not just a test of endurance. It was a transformation of identity, a story of faith, rebellion, mercy, and discipline unfolding day after day under the blazing sun and the silent stars. And today, we're going to step into that story, to walk beside Moses, to see what the people of Israel saw, to feel their fear, their hunger, their doubt, and the miracles that sustained them. This is not a story about the past. It's a mirror for every believer who's ever felt lost in their own desert, wondering if God still walks with them. So, as we begin, take a deep breath. Close your eyes if you can. Picture the desert wind brushing your face, the sand stretching endlessly before you, and the sound of a trumpet calling an entire nation to move. Because once the first step is taken, there's no turning back. This is where faith begins. In the book of Exodus, we're told that 600,000 men, not counting women and children, left Egypt together. They didn't just escape slavery. They became the heartbeat of a new nation. But organizing 1,000,000 people in the middle of nowhere, that would take more than courage. It would take divine strategy. And that's where our journey truly begins. The desert of discipline and miracles. When the Israelites left Egypt, the world had never seen anything like it. 600,000 men, plus women, children, and even foreigners who had joined them after witnessing the 10 plagues, all moving together like a living river through the wilderness. It wasn't just an escape. It was the beginning of a transformation, from slaves into a nation. But imagine the scale for a moment. If they walked in a single file, the line would stretch for more than 300 kilometers. By the time the first group reached the next camp, the last ones would still be leaving Egypt. And yet, somehow they moved with purpose. They weren't wandering aimlessly. Every tent, every tribe, every step was part of divine design. The order of the desert. God himself gave the blueprint. In the book of Numbers, chapter 2, he organized the people like an army around the tabernacle, his dwelling place among them. To the east, the tribes of Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. To the south, Reuben, Simeon, and Gad. To the west, Ephraim, Manasseh, and Benjamin. And to the north, Dan, Asher, and Naphtali. Each tribe marched beneath its own banner, colors and emblems that carried identity, pride, and purpose. When the trumpets sounded, every group knew exactly when and where to move. No GPS, no radios, just faith and the sound of silver trumpets echoing across the desert winds. The Levites carried the tabernacle in the center, God's presence at the heart of their journey. A pillar of cloud guided them by day, and a pillar of fire by night. It was order in chaos, a living symbol that even in the wilderness, God was still a God of structure and purpose. But discipline alone wasn't enough, because when 1,000,000 people cross a barren desert, order can't feed them. Faith can't fill their bellies. They needed miracles, and that's exactly what they received. Water from the impossible. 3 days after crossing the Red Sea, the water they carried was gone. The children cried. The animals collapsed. The people began to despair. Then they found water, but it was bitter, undrinkable. The place was called Marah, meaning bitterness. Moses prayed, desperate, and God showed him a simple tree. When Moses threw it into the water, the bitterness turned sweet. It wasn't just a miracle of chemistry. It was a message that God could turn even the bitterest moments of life into something life-giving. But the true test came at Rephidim. There was no water at all, not a drop. The crowd grew violent, ready to stone Moses. Then God told him, "Strike the rock with your staff." He obeyed, and from solid stone, water burst forth, a river of life flowing through dry land, enough for every man, woman, child, and animal. The Apostle Paul would later write that this rock followed them through the wilderness, a symbol of God's constant provision. Every drop a reminder that they weren't alone. Bread from heaven. But water was only the beginning. Soon, hunger came. The people cried, "If only we had died in Egypt, where we sat by pots of meat and ate all the bread we wanted." And God replied in mercy, "Behold, I will rain bread from heaven for you." The next morning, when the dew lifted, the ground was covered with something white and fine, delicate as frost. The people looked at it and asked, "What is it?" In Hebrew, manhu, what is this? And from that question came the name manna. They gathered it every morning, just enough for each day. If they tried to store it overnight, it rotted, except on the sixth day, when it miraculously lasted through the Sabbath. Every crumb was a lesson. Depend on God daily. Trust Him for tomorrow. And yet, human hearts are fickle. They grew tired of the manna, craving the meat and spices of Egypt. So God sent quail, so many that they covered the camp in a storm of feathers. But when greed replaced gratitude, a plague swept through the camp. The desert, it seemed, didn't just reveal hunger, it revealed the soul. Women of the wilderness. While the men grumbled, the women often carried the unseen burdens of survival. When water was scarce, it was the women who rationed it. When the manna fell, they ground it, baked it, and fed their families. They gave birth under tents, raised children in sandstorms, and still sang songs of hope. And some of them shaped history. Miriam, the sister of Moses, wasn't just a singer. She was a prophetess. After crossing the Red Sea, she led the women in dance and praise, tambourines in hand, their voices echoing across the desert night. But even leaders stumble. When she and Aaron spoke against Moses, questioning his authority, God struck her with leprosy. The punishment was harsh, but what followed was extraordinary. The entire nation of over 1 million people stopped their journey and waited 7 days until Miriam was healed. That's how much she mattered. Years later, 5 sisters, Ma, Noah, Hagla, Milcah, and Tirzah, stood before Moses with a bold request. Their father had died without sons, and by law, their family name would vanish. But they pleaded for justice. Why should our father's name disappear just because he had no sons? Give us a portion among our father's brothers. God agreed. For the first time, women were granted the right to inherit, a divine recognition of equality in a time when such ideas were unheard of. The desert was harsh, but it was also where faith, justice, and courage took root, the burden of leadership. But not all lessons came through peace. Moses, the leader of this restless nation, often stood alone. Every day, from sunrise to sunset, lines of people waited for his judgment. Disputes over land, food, family, even faith. His father-in-law, Jethro, saw the exhaustion in his eyes and said, "What you are doing is not good. You will wear yourself out." So Jethro gave him wisdom that would shape leadership forever. Select capable men who fear God, men of truth, who hate dishonest gain. Appoint them as rulers of thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. It was a pyramid of justice, one that distributed power and created order among chaos. Small matters were solved at lower levels. Great matters rose to Moses, a system so efficient that echoes of it still appear in modern law and government today. But leadership in the desert came with a price. Every decision was a test of obedience, not to the people, but to God, rebellion and judgment. Not everyone accepted that. A Levite named Korah, along with Dathan and Abiram, led a rebellion. They gathered 250 respected leaders and challenged Moses, saying, "All the congregation is holy. Why do you set yourselves above us?" It sounded fair. It sounded democratic. But beneath it was pride, the oldest sin of all. Moses fell on his face before God. Then he declared a test. Tomorrow, the Lord will show who belongs to him. Each man came with a censer of burning incense. Then the ground began to shake. The earth split open beneath their feet and swallowed them alive. Their tents, their families, everything they owned vanished in an instant. Then fire from the Lord consumed the 250 men who had followed them. The next day, the people complained again, and a plague broke out, killing 14,700, until Aaron ran to the camp with incense, standing between the living and the dead. Justice in the desert was swift and terrifying, but it was never without purpose. Every act was a reminder that holiness is not optional when you walk that close to God. The long road of discipline. Year after year, the desert became their teacher. When they broke the Sabbath, a man was stoned for gathering wood, a warning that obedience mattered, even in small things. When they fell into immorality with the women of Moab, 24,000 died before Phinehas, the grandson of Aaron, stopped the plague with one act of courage. The desert was not a punishment. It was a forge, burning away rebellion and fear, shaping a generation that would one day conquer the promised land. But to do that, the old generation had to die. The death of a generation. When the spies returned from Canaan, 10 of them spread fear, saying, "There are giants in the land. We are like grasshoppers in their eyes." And the people wept, refusing to go forward. God's response was firm. "All of you who are 20 years and older shall die in this wilderness. Only Joshua and Caleb will enter the land." It was the harshest sentence ever given to an entire nation. But it wasn't cruelty, it was transformation. The people who left Egypt had the body of free men, but the heart of slaves. They needed to die so that a new generation, one born in freedom, disciplined by the desert, could rise. And as the years passed, the old graves multiplied. Children became adults, warriors forged by hardship. They had never known the whip of an Egyptian, only the law of God and the rhythm of his miracles. By the time they reached the edge of the promised land, they were no longer a crowd of former slaves. They were an army of faith, the last days of Moses. Miriam died in Kadesh. Aaron died on Mount Hor. And finally, Moses climbed Mount Nebo. He was 120 years old. His eyes were still sharp, his strength undiminished. From that mountain, he saw the land God had promised, a land flowing with milk and honey. He saw the Jordan River, the hills of Jericho, the fields that his people would one day call home. But he could not enter. His mission was complete, to lead, to teach, to shape. When he died, the Bible says that no one knows his burial place. And no prophet ever rose in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, the God who walks through the desert. As the sun set over Mount Nebo, the desert fell silent. The man who once faced Pharaoh, who split the sea, who spoke with God as a friend, was gone. And below that mountain, a new leader stood waiting, Joshua, son of Nun, the same man who, decades earlier, had seen the promised land with his own eyes and said, "If the Lord delights in us, he will bring us into it." Now, that promise was about to come true. But before they crossed the Jordan, before they stepped onto the soil of Canaan, the people paused, just for a moment, and looked back. Behind them lay 40 years of dust and tears, 40 years of funerals and faith, 40 years of wandering that had burned away everything weak, fearful, and false. They were no longer the people who left Egypt in chains. They were a nation forged in fire. The meaning of the desert. You see, the desert was never a mistake. It was a design, a place where God stripped away comfort, so that only trust could remain. Every morning when manna appeared, he reminded them, "I am your provider." Every night when the pillar of fire blazed, he whispered, "I am your light." Every time water burst from a rock, he proved, "I can bring life from what looks dead." And when they failed, when they grumbled, when they doubted, he disciplined, but he didn't abandon. Because love doesn't mean letting us stay the same. It means walking with us, even through the wilderness that changes us. The journey through the desert was not about distance. It was about dependence. Not about punishment, but preparation. Not about delay, but destiny. The lessons they left behind. Today, thousands of years later, that same desert still speaks. Its sands whisper the same lessons to anyone who dares to listen. When you feel lost, remember, Israel once was too. When you feel dry and empty, remember the God who brought water from stone. When you feel forgotten, Remember that even when his people disobeyed, he guided them every single day, a cloud by day, a fire by night. Faith isn't about knowing where you're going. It's about knowing who walks beside you. Maybe your life feels like that wilderness, a long, endless path between where you were and where you hope to be. You pray, you wait, and sometimes nothing seems to change. But the God of the desert is the same today. He still provides manna for those who trust him daily. He still parts seas when you've reached your limit. And he still leads people from bondage to promise. Crossing the river. When the time finally came, God told Joshua, "Be strong and courageous, for the Lord your God will be with you wherever you go." And as the priest stepped into Jordan, carrying the Ark of the Covenant, the waters stopped, not in a storm, not in chaos, but in perfect stillness. The people crossed on dry ground once again, just as their parents had crossed the Red Sea 40 years before. It was like a divine echo, the same power, the same faithfulness, but a new generation walking forward. And that's how God works. He repeats miracles until we finally believe. The God who finishes what he starts. When we read the story of Exodus, it's easy to focus on the miracles, the plagues, the manna, the parted sea. But maybe the greatest miracle of all wasn't the fire or the water. It was in the waiting, in the slow daily faith that kept an entire nation moving through a wilderness that could have killed them. God didn't just free them from Egypt. He freed Egypt from them. He took away the chains on their wrists, and then, through the desert, he broke the chains in their hearts. And maybe that's what he's doing in your life too. Because we all have our deserts, places where we feel lost, tired, unsure if we'll ever reach what he promised. But every dry place has a purpose. Every silence hides a seed. The Israelites didn't die in the desert. They discovered God there, the eternal promise. When they finally entered the land, they carried more than gold or grain. They carried a memory of every sunrise over the dunes, every prayer answered in the impossible, every tear that turned to triumph. And maybe that's the point, because the promised land wasn't just a place on a map. It was a promise written on their hearts. A promise that wherever they go, whatever deserts they face, God is not far away. He still walks with his people. He still feeds the hungry soul. He still brings water from stone. And when the world feels dry, he still whispers, "I am with you, even in the wilderness." So if you ever find yourself in your own desert, remember the story of those who walked before you, because the same God who led them by fire and cloud still leads us today one step at a time.